World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus and the season finale of our World Affairs Roundup. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In a recent op-ed piece commissioned by the Institute of World Affairs, Emmy Award-winning journalist David Marish warned that the protracted presidential campaign is capturing news budgets and airtime that would otherwise go to the coverage of world events. As a result, campaign analysis is, in his words, sealed in its own intellectual bubble, picking up every candidate gaffe or conflict like pennies off the pavement, while the winner will have to deal with rolls on down the street unobserved. In response, we've asked our World Affairs Roundup panel of prognosticators to come up with trends and issues that will find their way into the next president's inbox, but will be lost in this summer's campaign coverage. Ready to read the iced tea leaves, we're joined by our regular trio of World Affairs oracles. John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, thanks for taking on this challenge of trying to put your fingers on the most underreported but significant issues. And I'd like to go down the row and hear from each of you, but John, why don't we start with you?
Okay. When the idea came up to look at the issues that weren't likely to be talked about in the election, Africa seemed like a natural for that. But with the issue that Robert's going to talk about, the food crisis and resource crisis in the world, Africa is looming up a little higher, although I don't think it will be talked purely in African terms. The other issue that complicates it is that we now have a black American candidate for president, which could mean more attention to Africa. But Africa has plenty of problems. I mean, in addition to the drought, they have the HIV crisis, they have corrupt governance issues based mostly on tribal interests, they have modest resources, and much of that not placed in particularly great places. The agricultural potential is not wonderful because the best lands have the least amount of water. And there are the geographical disconnects in Africa. I was looking on Expedia on how to get from, say, Dakar to Nairobi, and I had to generally go from Africa to Europe and back to Africa in order to get there. Looking ahead, and I'll do this in terms of some of the people who have been talking to the bigger issues in Africa. Kofi Annan has just started up a new group called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And as I listened to him talk the other night on the Laren NewsHour, I was struck by the fact that I'm hearing largely the same kind of rhetoric that I had heard when I was in Africa in the early 80s. I spent 3 very interesting years in Zambia, Lusaka, Zambia, and our USAID mission was involved in all the kinds of things that Kofi Annan is talking about, improving the seeds and working on soil and coming up with better farm practices. And they've been doing that not only in Zambia, but across the continent before I got there and since I left.
John, I remember in the Clinton administration, after the genocide in Rwanda broke out, there was exposés, people talked about how could this have totally blindsided the administration? And there was, I remember one Defense Department official having said early in the administration he nominated Rwanda, Burundi to be on this list of strategic priorities and was told, we have no strategic interests there. So what's the strategic, I mean, you've rattled off several pieces, but I mean, has much changed in the sense of that there really are strategic interests, or we will recognize them in Africa?
We, I think, are caught up in the same syndrome that African countries are caught up. Africa is largely a product of the colonial period. except for possibly Ethiopia, maybe one or two other countries. These are all constructs of a colonial past. Therefore, the logic that went into creating these were for the colonializers, the colonizers, as opposed to the indigenous. So you've got tribes pitted against each other in several countries for reasons that were good for the colonizers. If you look ahead, and it strikes me that an idea that's being brought out by a Pomona academic by the name of Engelbert, that Africa needs to disintegrate before it can be put back together. Now, I recognize that the complications that come from that, that's almost in no one's interest. The UN would not have a role in this because the UN is a nation-state organization. All the rulers that are currently in Africa would have very little interest in seeing this come about. The West would have very little interest because it produces instability and uncertainty. So, but short of that, every effort to try and reform, reestablish, only brings in new tribes, new interests, and using largely the same infrastructure that existed before.
So combating the governance issues, which one way or another, I guess it makes the countries that make up the continent ungovernable or poorly governed spaces, which then poses all kinds of risks for lots of the issues, HIV, security.
Right. Well, every new government that comes in adopts the same mechanisms, uses the same levers, but only to reward their groups as opposed to the ones who were pushed out.
Robert? And Anne, do you have any comments, thoughts?
I can just say, I mean, there's a term that's being bandied around today called Afro-pessimism. That, you know, it seems to go on and on. All sorts of botched and failed elections, African strongmen who hold on forever, etc. There is one school of thought that all of the recent controversies around elections in Africa are actually a sign that there's growing popular movements to try to take back their governments. Now, it's admitted that these are also elite-led, that in fact the people at the grassroots level don't have the resources to challenge the state. But there does seem to be more opening for you had talked about kind of destruction of the states. Whether it would lead to stable democracies is another question. But you know, in a new internet age with a lot more trade, with China coming in, there's a lot more exposure to ideas, and so there seems to be the possibility of change. Whether it's going to be positive change or not, it's much too early to tell.
And some would say that the Robert Mugabe holding on to power despite apparently having lost an election is tragic, and the international community hasn't really come down very strong on this. But now that stands out. So in other words, that there are places where, even in Kenya, the elections didn't go well, but it's something different than just one person.
Well, they was forced to have elections, was part of there being this movement,
sure,
right? And so he would have just been able to hold on to power for years before without his legitimacy being challenged and revealed as illegitimate as it is, obviously.
I recognize what is being suggested is rather draconian, and it comes with, and I'm not even suggesting it, I'm just thinking that as I look at the model that we've been playing for 40, 50 years, it's not producing any change, real change. And you may be right that there might be some modest adjustments occurring, and we'll have to watch that.
I mean, there's a buzzword in nonprofit world in the United States called leadership development, which is bandied around. I can't imagine you can't train these leaders to be legitimate, far-sighted leaders that care about the common good in their countries or of the whole continent. It just doesn't work that way. You need real popular movements and real civic society that gets built up.
So this may be one of those issues, John, you've listed several of them, Robert talked about several of them, that our viewers and others concerned are going to have to find other ways to keep informed about on the internet or wherever, because a lot of these issues are not going away, right?
Well, and just one final point on it. If you look at the efforts in Africa for change, none of this has been, except for a couple of exceptions, and Biafra is one that comes to mind, has been in terms of breaking off. Everything has been in replacing and using the same mechanisms. And so maybe what we're seeing in Europe and lots of other places is a breakdown to more common elements, and maybe they need to fall back to their tribal connections.
I want to shift over to Anne, and because I know, Anne, you've taken on a whole another large swath of the world.
The continent. I wanted to talk about Latin America, which it's not just neglected during the election season, but generally neglected all the time, particularly in the post 9/11 world. It was important during the Cold War because of all the geopolitical issues that were involved Central and South American countries. But the period that we've been going through lately has been referred to as one of benign neglect. But while the United States has been ignoring Latin America, and it's not just the press, it's the government as well, a lot of things have been happening that have made some leaders and pundits come out and say, who lost Latin America? Or wringing their hands, we have to start paying attention to this because now we have half of the governments down there are run by communists. And, you know, they talk about the pink tide. You know, it's been sweeping over.
The new left in Latin America.
The new left in Latin America.
It's not deep red, but it's pink.
It's pink. It's pink. And, you know, Hugo Chavez thumbing his nose at the United States all the time. And the big question is, you know, some people think, well, we can take Latin America for granted. It's always supported us. We've always been able to rely on it for resources. In other words, we've always just used it, and consistent with the Monroe Doctrine. But then others are saying, no, we have to change. We have to change because we've lost something important. And the big question is, how important is it, and to our national interests?
Well, I mean, let me press you on that. How important do you think it is? I mean,
well, I think it is. I think it is important for a number of reasons. One is, of course, geography. The geography issue is not new. We've always had this, you know, Mexico and Latin America below our borders. But even if you think of this in terms of security at this point, Latin America, and I'm using it very broadly, is very, very important to our security. It's a transit point, and we need it to be stable. I mean, the fact that it has been stable has allowed us to engage other areas of the world. If there were a Lebanon nearby, we would have a completely different looking foreign policy. And I think that we have to pay attention to, it's important because of the whole issue of whether or not the United States should be promoting democracy. This is an area where a lot of countries have actually had legitimate elections, even though the results have not been to the liking of the United States in some cases. And if we believe that democratic governments are, if there's a democratic peace thesis, if this is the best way of at least starting to approach poverty and fighting terrorism, then we have to pay attention to our relationships with those governments.
Right. Take contrasting that with many of the governments in Africa that you were talking about, John, achieving stable, even prosperous democracies you're much closer to that goal in Latin America than, say, you are in Africa, which argues for investment in that part of the world.
It certainly does. And, you know, some people have said that, I mean, these are people to the far right, have said that, you know, there are Al-Qaeda cells there, that there's, you know, that Chavez is really a Latino jihadist and all this other stuff. But in fact, there have been successful, you know, there have been successful democratic elections. They actually represent the will of the people, who have legitimate concerns, legitimate complaints against former governments.
Let me stop us there, and we'll pick this up after the break. I want to get John and Robert in on this discussion. To our viewers, we'll be right back in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our season finale, World Affairs Roundup. Anne, you were talking about Latin America as the area of, you think, will be undercovered and needs some attention. And I just want to let you finish up the thought I interrupted you on before we broke.
Well, I guess I just wanted to, I think it's important for the United States to pay more attention to it. I don't necessarily think that a new government will change any of its policies towards Latin America. That's not a given at all. But when you look at our relations with Latin America, I think the primary problem has been one of arrogance. And the way the Latin Americans perceive that. It doesn't sound like it should be very important, but when you have people like Robert Kraig, who's Deputy Secretary of State, saying about the Brazilians when they refused to conclude a trade agreement with the United States. He said, you know, if the Brazilians don't want to conclude a trade agreement with the United States, well then let them go conclude a trade agreement with the penguins in Antarctica. I mean, and that kind of, you find these quotes all over the place. And so it's this taking for granted that it will always be there and not wanting to deal with countries in the Southern Cone as real partners with legitimate interests is something that will be in the inbox, I think, of the new president.
I would say the economic interests are going to be driving a much closer relationship. NAFTA was the first round, bringing Mexico into the mix. We are talking to others in terms of a free zone, a trade zone. Latin America, with their UNA and SR proposal, the 12 countries trying to set up a counterpoint to the United States, though it doesn't get much media attention in the United States, is something that certainly the State Department is going to pay attention to.
Yeah, and what Anne described as the kind of American arrogance towards South America, and Latin America in general, but especially South America, has driven, I think, a lot of the attempt by left-leaning leaders to create a different kind of global trading regime. Mm-hmm. Now, what they've proposed, aside from Chavez's rhetoric, is not very radical. They've not created a whole new alternative system at all, but it's more of it is a little different. If you want to have democracies, by the way, it might be, right? Mm-hmm. And if we want to respect democracy, we have to listen, but also it's part of this self-assertiveness that they're tired of being under the boot of the United States and want to find a different path. What's been proposed in a lot of these countries, what's being done, say in Brazil, is not very different in terms of the global economy. They're not being more environmentally conscious or sustainable in terms of their investments, but they do want to have a distinct path, and they don't necessarily want to just have trade dictated to them by the United States and its global corporations. And so I think part of the thing you said about self-esteem and the arrogance of the United States is driving this, and it's a very moderate left-wing tilt. Most of these folks are what we'd call liberals. They're not communists, if you know what I'm saying, per se.
Which some might consider those two things the same. But is it given the history, I mean, is it possible to overcome that image and maybe that distrust toward the U.S. to have a closer relationship? I mean, John, will the economics of the matter sort of trump any kind of...
will stand on their own. I mean, if there is interest if there is interest in trading and expanding that trade, I think that will work. I don't think that the fact that the United States is the only superpower and is the biggest power in the region is not going to go away. The reaction to that is always going to be there. It always was there, regardless of the administration in Washington.
Right, but since the end of the Cold War, in this period of post 9/11, there's been this unexpected opportunity for a number of Latin American countries to actually act independently in ways that they had not been able to before, which creates a different situation, a different set of dynamics for the United States.
I agree. Mm-hmm.
And Brazil has the potential not of being a superpower, but a great power. And if it can organize the other countries there, Colombia being the outlier at our behest, into UNISAR, this NATO or UN-like structure, then they can be much more of a major national player. They won't match up the United States, but they're a country that has to be taken seriously if they can achieve that project.
And that isn't necessarily against U.S. interest in the long run.
Right.
Well, speaking of U.S. interests and issues that will be underreported relative to those interests, Robert, let's shift on to the resource issues that you wanted to talk about.
Sure, and obviously oil prices to a great degree.
I haven't noticed that.
And to a lesser degree, the food crisis that's gone on throughout the world, and food prices even in this country, are going to be discussed in this presidential election. The reason I selected this area is because their magnitude and seriousness is much greater than will be discussed. This is not a matter of having a federal gas tax holiday in order to resolve the issue, which is the level of the presidential debate right now. It's something much deeper. As far as oil goes, there are a lot of experts who believe that we are already at peak oil, which means once you reach peak oil, then it's a decline each and every year. And with growing economies, especially China and India, it means that that oil prices could be not just $130 a barrel, but $200 a barrel, and this could be a permanent situation. And that has huge economic ramifications. One of the biggest ramifications it has is on agriculture, and so it's interconnected with the food crisis. Now, the food crisis is very serious in a number of levels. Oil prices have made it worse. We have a very energy-intensive agricultural system that we've implemented, and also it costs a lot more to transport food, fertilizer, etc. It also, biofuels comes into this. We've done a lot in this country, especially to subsidize biofuels industry, but now it is more profitable, even if you took those subsidies away, to grow corn for fuel than it is to grow it for food, and it still doesn't make much of a dent in the use of oil and other fossil fuels. As far as food goes, it's a deeper crisis in our whole system. What happened with in the 80s and 90s with the IMF and the World Bank, and then with trade liberalization under WTO especially, is an opening up of the economy in a way that discouraged peasant agriculture. And so places like Mexico that used to be self-sufficient on corn production, or Philippines with rice production, had their agricultural sectors disinvested in. And that was forced by trade liberalization and by the International Monetary Fund and the monetary regime. And the result has been they are dependent now on a world market. They're importers. You had riots in Mexico last year over tortilla prices. You can expect that to occur again, quite frankly, in a lot of other countries. And now we have less ability to grow food. But there's an even deeper problem in that, given what an environmental toll agriculture takes on the world, we actually are in a position that even if we did a lot more, even if we built those sectors again in the third world and made countries more self-sufficient, we still couldn't grow food to keep with increasing demand in India, Brazil, and the rest of the third world. And so we actually would need something like a huge investment in organic agriculture and less energy-intensive agriculture and less agribusiness-like agriculture, and huge investment in alternative energies that we could, a huge, like Manhattan Project-like investment in order to get off dependence on foreign oil very quickly. And the truth is, the United States, which needs to lead on this, has been distracted by the Bush administration's Iraq war fiasco, and we've lost 8 years in this whole process, and we may not be able to catch up. So that, I would say that these issues will definitely be in the inbox of the next
Let me
president.
bring in Ann and John. I mean, there are two views here. I mean, Robert's sort of laid out lots of the ramifications of the food crisis being kind of the tip of this, and that the instability, some of them said the instability you could see based on rising oil and rising energy and food prices, it dwarfs the instability you can get from terrorism, versus those that will say, hey, this is the commodities market, this is what happens, prices go up, prices go down. Where are you guys at?
I'm not as far on this on the food issue as Robert was saying. I watched it in Zambia, and while I'm aware that the IMF and the World Bank laid down certain encouragements to move countries into more industrial areas, the countries went into this with great enthusiasm. I watched Zambia during my time wrestle with the fact that copper price that they had, which was so very high, when it dropped to the floor, they were stuck with an urbanization and a population growth that could not sustain and they had many more resources for agriculture than lots of other countries in Africa, for example. So it's the population growth that's occurring in the worst, in the most vulnerable places, coupled with the desire to shift to more profitable industries as opposed to agriculture, that's fueling this as well.
And when you said, though, that they welcomed this when you were in Zambia, you're talking about the elite, though, right? I mean, the government.
Yes, the government.
The government.
Right.
So that's who we've already talked about how corrupt they are, and that they don't have the interests of the population
because
they don't care. I mean, obviously, this whole food thing, and in our campaign, it's very distorted because of the whole agricultural subsidy issue, which I don't think very many. I mean, not only is it not covered here that much, but not that many Americans understand what kinds of subsidies we give to our farmers and the extent that this might have. They just think that we're sending food benevolently all over the world and feeding everybody without understanding the ways that these subsidies can actually distort markets and provide disincentives for farmers to produce in other countries.
Well, in all fairness, most Western countries subsidize their agriculture. So, I mean, this is not just the U.S. In fact, the French probably have higher subsidies for their farmers than we do.
So the IMF and World Bank undermined subsidies in places like Mexico and the Philippines as part of austerity programs, but then they remained in the United States, which distorted the market
they can't control.
even further. And created the situation where countries can't feed themselves and agricultural production is topped out anyway. So and it's connected to energy. So it leads to this huge issue where we need a level of leadership that's much greater than we've had in the world in order to deal with problems of this magnitude.
There's a counterintuitive push as well. As long as oil prices were low, the need for other strategic resources was increasing. And that's why you see China running around Africa and Latin America, tying up markets and the ability to get the stuff. As oil prices shoot up and industrialization is put on more on hold, their need for these other resources are going to go down, and so the markets will play into that.
Well, let me have to cut our discussion off there. Thank you very much, John Katzka, Ann Hamilton, Robert Kraig, for elucidating several really important issues in the world. To our viewers, I think we'll put the challenge back in your laps now. As less of this news coverage is coming to you in the regular media, it's going to be on you to find out and keep yourself informed about these issues and others as we move through this campaign season. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next season on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,